From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Mic works. I'm Pam Jackson. I'm director for the Center for the Book here at the Library of Congress, and we're part of the new National and International Outreach Unit, and we welcome you to this afternoon's program. A part of our vision here at the Library of Congress is that we are the chief steward of the record of knowledge of America and thus the world, creating a springboard to the future. And it's a future that I just create in my mind that's one of compassion and courage and industry and achievement and accomplishment and honor and peace and harmony. And I believe there's nothing more wonderful than the art of poetry to be both a healing, soothing balm and a vibrant source of self-expression. Sometimes it's an equalizer, sometimes it's a neutralizer. A part of the library's central mission is to provide the American people with a very rich, enduring source of knowledge that can be relied upon to inform, engage, and inspire societies. And today's program is a part of that endeavor. Here at the Center for the Book, which includes the Poetry and Literature Center and the Young Readers Center, we promote books and library, literacy and reading, poetry and literature, knowing that they're the best tools for engaged, informed societies, for the protection and preservation of democracy, and they're the best weapons against ignorance and intolerance. Today, we have the opportunity to explore ways in which poetry and poetry publishing push us to understand our national dialogue on race and to do so in empowering ways. And to start us off on our discussion, we have Rob Casper, who's the head of the Library of Congress Poetry and Literature Center, who will introduce our 4 poet publishers. I'd like to bring Rob to the microphone and just acknowledge him for being a very remarkable, inspiring, bright, and talented human being who's a very big contributor to the library and the poetry community. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Pam. I'm excited to introduce today's panel, which I have a personal connection to. Not so long ago, before starting this job as the head of the Poetry and Literature Center, I published the literary magazine Jubilant, and Kathy Park Hong and Evie Shockley were the last 2 editors I had the privilege of working with. In a sense, this panel represents both the continuation and an expansion of our conversations. I also owe a debt to my program specialist, Anya Kreitney, who helped to develop the panel from the beginning. Thank you, Anya. Before we begin, let me ask you to turn off your cell phones and any electronic devices you have that might interfere with our event. Second, please note that this program is being recorded, and by participating, you give us permission for any future use of the recording. Finally, let me tell you a little bit about the Poetry and Literature Center. We are home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, and we put on 30 to 40 public programs like this one per year. In 2 days' time, for instance, we're featuring poet Monica Yoon in our first ever Law and Literature program. To find out more about the season of literary programs at the library, you can go check out the table in the back in the foyer, or you can visit our website, www.loc.gov/poetry. Here's how today's event will work. First, I've asked each panelist to come up to the podium and read a poem they've published, which they feel speaks to issues about race in ways that prose or other forms of artistic expression cannot. Afterwards, I will lead a moderated discussion, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of the program for your questions. We also have books for sale by all of our poet editor panelists, and I know they'll be happy to have to sign them for you. You can read more about our panelists in the print program you should all have, if not on your chair, next to your chair. But let me say how proud I am to have them all here, traveling from around the country. Each of them are dynamic, open, insightful, and deeply engaged, both as poets and editors. And together, I know we'll explore how poems enrich and challenge us, as well as the role literary magazines and presses play in getting poetry to its eager readers. Please join me in welcoming Carmen Jimenez-Smith, Kathy Park Hong, Don Scher, and Edie Shockley.
And I just read the poem and then we talk about it. Okay. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to read a poem by Vanessa Villarreal, who is a poet. I'm a publisher. I have a small press called Noemi Press. It's a press that's celebrating its 15th year next year. It started as a chapbook press, and we've been publishing full-length collections for about 8 years now. This book is from a series that we published called Acrylica. The Acrylica series is named after our poet laureate Juan Felipe Herrera's groundbreaking bilingual collection of poetry called Acrylica. And the series, which has published 4 books and has really exciting books coming out, is interested in the work of innovative Latino writers. This book, Beast Meridian by Vanessa Villarreal, will be published in March of next year. Girl Body Gift. First dressed as a boy, an early 11, iron papi's khakis, a Dickies crease with white t-shirt, gel comb, black slick back como linda. Me and my girls look hard, get caught. Papi's hands crush my neck. Si no te compones, te voy a matar aquí, no quiero jotas. First kiss 12, Chauncey, Saturnine, Centaur, trembling to Jodeci. First boyfriend Tyrone, MJ smile, you want to go with me. Spiral perm and Boys to Men to sleep in his Rockets jersey. Papi's backhand, no quiero que andes con los pinches negros. First against light-eyed Cedric, dream prince of pines, appears at a sleepover. The moon is a pill in my can. Dazed, I kneel, Dick, a dark poppy, no, a muffled petal in my throat. Not all my yet, tells his boys. First white boy, summer night, a stolen sapphire, shooting stars on slide, 3 a.m. taut orchid drum. Mommy pregnant, due to work at 7, searching the milky fog, caught in Chevy headlights. Slut to his boys, bifurcate my head, shave bottom half. Rocks pelt my back on tracks, and with my new names I can now fathom my father. Hospital roommate Nicole, lily from breasts on sterile white sheets. Hillary, pink vodka mattress. Tina and Lee, a yearning of triangles. 17, doctor writes, hymen intact. A knot hot and sharp as wood salt on the cord in my star heart. I'm interested in this poem for many reasons. I love the compression in the language, but I also really appreciate how it inscribes a couple of different things. One of them is the racial issues that emerge among people of color, which I think is a question or a problem or an issue that not too many people engage with, but I think is really important as a person of color to consider the ways in which we all participate in the horizontal oppression of race. I also think that one of the challenges of being a Latina is the ways in which our sexuality is used as a kind of currency, and Latina sexuality and I guess affect is stereotyped or made precious. And I appreciate that this poem does a really beautiful job of complicating what Latina sexuality is. So, thank you.
Hi. Hi, I'm the poetry editor for the New Republic, which used to be solely based in DC and now also has an office in New York City. And I'm relatively new. I became editor, I think, in 2014, in the winter of 2014. And it was actually a very contentious time for that magazine because, you know, there was a whole walkout, a whole staff walkout. And this was all over the news, and there was a big uproar, and a lot of journalists were saying in the New York Times and so forth that the magazine was destroyed. And then the editor-in-chief, Gabriel Snyder, at the Times, who was actually a friend of mine, called me up and asked me if I wanted to be the poetry editor, which was which was very much a surprise to me because it's a perch that I haven't been in for a long time, except I used to edit Jubilot with Rob and Evie. So it was definitely, I was ambivalent about it, but then I grew to love it. And, you know, I thought I would read the inaugural poem that I actually commissioned from a young poet named Ricky Laurentis. And, you know, though there was this huge uproar about how the magazine was destroyed, there were, you know, a few people who were saying, you know, maybe the magazine needs some revamping, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, who in the Atlantic said that, what was he saying? Let's see, how the family rose at TNR's virtual funeral looks like a whites-only section of a Jim Crow-era movie house. For most of the modern history, TNR has been an entirely white publication. So I thought, as my part as a poetry editor, it would be, I wanted to kind of revise that legacy. And this is a poem called Continuance by Ricky Laurentis, and it's a few months past Ferguson. So it's actually in memoriam to Ferguson and Mike Brown. Ferguson, Missouri, 2014, in memoriam. Forever here, Mr. Dark, and tricking me, steaming from a manhole in Missouri, or else you're damp between the motions of the trees, revealing the breezy discourse of those trees, black sound. I can see now how everything I've learned of you is wrong, how an air of dumb assumption lounged on my brow, a liar, winking, claiming a shadow is as empty as my childhood vision of the falling sun meant emptiness. But every child knows what moves the wind at night, knows what leads some birds to develop their unrest in the high green of some trees or lower. What leans against that tree's bark? A man? Or is it the just barely intelligible idea of one, head back, maybe eyes closed, moaning, working to hysteria, the erection rising like a haunted chain away from him? If I move closer, carrying a glass cup, if my mouth is that cup. Though I've known fear move as bravely in this world, move like a physical man, it can shoot a boy. So shoot me. Who said that? Was it really the black of my tongue? But how could any breed of blackness ever wish to be penetrated? I can tell you how a foot creaks, even falling dead in the night, could tell the red a mother cries when she feels the absence drop, like pity inside her. But I cannot say what a bullet says as it enters a child's skin. But come in, you can enter me, Mr. Dark. Let tonight be the first night I deeper see the pregnant possibilities of your design. How your fingers move to build such attitudes, turning a moaning of the wind into a man, making what is a tease of grass at the heel into terror, now pleasure, then back to grass again. Aren't you the mirror in which all lights balance? Aren't you the line on which all lines cross? Anything lives in you, so that dark over there can be the dark of Mike Brown, full of breath. That the dark right here can be the dark of my own bastard mind. That this dark come closest to my lips is a shadow's knowledge, full, not ever empty, charitable as it is wicked, risky as is good, fascination, perversion, and I move to it, to you, a shadow chaser, hearing the birds make restlessness in the trees, watching the man stroke velvet from his body, head still back, maybe eyes parted, singing now. He's at that point when I must surrender my knees to gravity and mouth ready, get gone. I'll choose what ground I lie on.
I'll read a poem from the March 2014 issue of Poetry Magazine. Since this poem appeared, it's gotten about 12,000 hits a day on the poetryfoundation.org website. Also in this issue were poems from Claudia Rankine, Citizen, although the book hadn't come out yet. And the best thing to do is to look for the poet reading this poem on YouTube. It's Denez Smith, Alternate Names for Black Boys. 1. Smoke above the burning bush. 2. Arch nemesis of summer night. 3. First son of soil. 4. Coal awaiting spark and wind. 5. Guilty until proven dead. 6. Oil heavy starlight. 7. Monster until proven ghost. 8. Gone. 9. Phoenix who forgets to unash. 10. Going, going, gone. 11. Gods of shovels and black veils. 12. What once passed for kindling. 13. Fireworks at dawn. 14. Brilliant shadow-hued coral. 15. I thought to leave this blank, but who am I to name us nothing? 16. Prayer who learned to bite and sprint. 17. A mother's joy and clutched breath. This issue of Poetry Magazine was produced in collaboration with the Split This Rock Poetry Festival. It was co-edited with Sarah Browning, who's in the room, and both Sarah Browning and Split This Rock are institutions y'all can support locally and should. And when we published these poems, this was before Ferguson, before so much that we're used to waking up to and hearing in the news relentlessly was starting to become known to the general and wider world. And sometimes poems and poets become fixed in the time and place of our imaginations. And Denez is one, Claudia Rankine is another. The issue also had Tim Siebel's Nikki Finney. When we put that issue together, we read, as we always do, at the magazine and with our co-editor, in this case Sarah, we looked for the best poems. We were looking for poems that meant something to us as people, as readers. You know, sometimes the word, we'll talk about this, gatekeeper gets tossed around, but we had no gates and weren't keeping anything. We were putting poems in front of eyeballs. And we believed in the poets and the poems, and we knew of their significance and vitality, but what we didn't understand yet was how these poems, like the best poems, sort of know things before everyone else does. Poems know what's going to happen before things happen in a way, because poets are people, I'm stealing from Henry James, but they're people on whom nothing is lost. And so sadly, these poems came to a kind of moment some time after the publication in these pages occurred. And although I'm sorry that the occasion for the poetry recurs, I'm glad that the poets were there. Not just for readers now with whom they resonate, but I think when people look back on our time and want to know what was going on here, they'll have the history books and they'll say certain things and there'll be sort of journalism available to people. But if they want to know what it was like, they'll turn to the poets. If they want to know what were people doing when all this stuff happened, they'll turn to the poets and the poems. And so there are many other poems I think all of us could read that have come to occupy a place that I think will never be these poems will never become dislodged, though you never know. But I think that's something we had gotten complacent about as editors, as readers, that we thought poems and poetry was a kind of process that was always unfolding and always kind of there. What we didn't, I think, realize, and we do now, is the urgency and necessity for this work to help us not only understand what's going on, but to fight things that need fighting and to empower people who didn't have the power to fight.
Hi, I'm Evie Shockley, and I currently am the creative writing editor for Feminist Studies, which is primarily an academic journal in the field of women's and genders, sexuality studies. But from its inception, Feminist Studies has always published creative writing, and I was very delighted when I was asked to come on board and serve on the editorial board in the role of the particular sort of shepherd of creative writing. My work there, though, involves a much smaller volume because there are only a certain number of pages per issue in a journal that only publishes a couple to 3 times a year. A small volume of creative work, and because I work with creative nonfiction, fiction, and poetry, an even smaller volume of poetry. So I'm going to be reading and talking about a poem that I published when I was working on Jubilat with Rob and Kathy. And so this poem is one that we published in Jubilat 18 in 2010. It's by a poet named Marcus Wicker, and the title is Love Letter to Justin Timberlake. When I think of you, it is always of a small, locked room. A principal's dark, full lips pressed together in a smirk. A glare from his fat, gold herringbone chain, burning tears in my eyes. My face, red as yours in direct sunlight. And even as my voice shut down that day, I knew ditching to buy NSYNC CD was worth more than prescriptive speech class. What I heard, 4 voices harmonized in a plastic bottle. Your falsetto blowing the top off. Michael Jackson with no abusive boxer father or snatched childhood. Sam Cooke, sans German shepherds stalking through his songs. I've been watching James Brown and Jackie Wilson make pelvic fixation public domain since I was old enough to work a remote. And I have yet to elude starched lines. How did you learn to dance your way out of boxes? Or did you find it easy as breathing, like whistling the national anthem? Do you remember the Super Bowl? How you tore Janet Jackson's breast from her top? I love you that way. Her earth-brown bounty of flesh, large black nipple, pierced, wind-chapped, hardened, and you saying, go ahead, look. I chose this poem out of the many I could have gone with because it takes up a subject that has been back in the news somewhat spectacularly in the last few weeks, cultural appropriation. I'm thinking of the novelist Lionel Shriver's highly publicized remarks in defense of what she described as a writer's right to imagination, to create characters whose identity is different in some respects, or in many, from the writer's own. In the wake of her talk, which she delivered wearing a sombrero, just to be clear, there has been a widespread conversation about the difference between the necessary and often vital work of a writer depicting lives outside of their own experience, and the problematic, all too common instance of a societally privileged writer exploiting the cultures and identities of disenfranchised, socially marginalized others. Wicker's poem locates the issue in the realm of music rather than literature, of course, but it gives us a space for thinking about the same questions raised by Shriver's expression of entitlement to instrumentalize and commodify the experience of the less powerful. The form of the poem allows Wicker to initiate our thinking about these things without ever using the phrase cultural appropriation. It begins with a scene of memory in which the speaker is in trouble for not being where he was supposed to be in class, and as a result has been reconfined in a small locked room. His adoration of NSYNC, the boy band in which Timberlake got his start, has made the punishment worth it to the speaker. The poem sets the speaker's love and trouble in the context of a list of African American musician performers whom both he and Timberlake apparently love: Michael Jackson and Sam Cooke, James Brown and Jackie Wilson. A deep appreciation for the genius of these men as entertainers is what the speaker and Timberlake have in common. But while the speaker also shares with them an experience of trouble, his tears and shut down voice shadows Michael Jackson's experience of abuse and Cooke's of being stalked by German shepherds. Timberlake's done taken their blues and gone. How did you learn to dance your way out of boxes? The speaker apostrophizes his one-time hero. The subsequent lines of the poem suggest that the answer has much to do with Timberlake's easy sense of belonging in a white supremacist nation. Wicker ends with a fascinating and disquieting image of Timberlake enacting his access or right to Black culture, which is embodied in not Michael, but Janet Jackson's earth-brown bounty of flesh. This Jackson, who also bears the marks of trouble, her exposed breast is pierced, wind-chapped, hardened, lays bare, so to speak, the currency Timberlake has traded in for his success. And in a move that Shriver could learn from, Wicker problematizes his own participation in this between men triangle that in turn instrumentalizes Black women's bodies with the productively ambiguous admission, I love you that way, bought and paid for.
Wow, what a great group of presentations and poems to begin this conversation with. So varied, as the presentations were very good, all sort of asserting the essential power of the lyric poem. I wanted to begin by sort of riffing off of what Don said about this particular moment and asking you all to weigh in on whether you feel that what's happening in poetry right now, the kinds of poems that you've been excited to publish, especially poems that address issues related to race, is part of a larger tradition. I mean, there's something to be said about how these poems may be sort of working within our culture, but there's also something to be said about, you know, the lineage they come from and the lineage that we are championing as editors. So maybe you could talk about that.
I'll begin. I mean, I think that I am a poet and also who's always been interested in race because of who I am and just, you know, and because of my politics, and it's something that I can, you know, I've always confronted, and that was something that I wanted to bring in as an editor. And even though when I first took on the editing job, I was a little bit nervous and skeptical about the position, I realized that it was a great opportunity to publish poets who wouldn't normally be published in a glossy magazine. And so that was, And it's been really, I mean, basically I've been able to, the poets who I tend to love are poets who somehow fold in politics into their aesthetic, into their language. And it's not just that they're writing about race or they're writing about this. And I think this is something that I get a little bit worried about now, because right now there's been this national discourse on race. It's a real hot button issue right now. It's been like that for the last few years, but this is also the history of America. But I think our tendencies, our historical and sort of literary tendency, is to kind of sort of decide when to train our camera on race and when to turn away from race. And what I'm afraid is that, I think our interest in race right now, especially as poets, or interest in reading, I mean, a lot of times, basically what I'm saying is that we treat the poem about race as the occasional poem. Like, oh, now, since we're talking about Islamophobia, why don't we bring up this poem by this young Muslim poet and pay attention to her? And, so it becomes, so the identity of the poet of color is usually so much more attached to what's happening on politically. And, it's for me as a poet and as an editor, it's really important that this conversation is sustained and continued. And I do think that actually our literary landscape is changing. I do think that, even though I have that concern or that worry, I also think that we're having a bit of a renaissance right now in terms of the amazing number of poets of color who have been getting published, the collections and the poems and so forth. Yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Really, it's a question about what may have preceded this moment, both in terms of what publishers have done, but also in terms of what poets were doing, writing about issues related to race. That may be changing now in terms of, as you said, Kathy, how it fits into a sort of larger national conversation. But still, I mean, my feeling as an editor is that there were poems there, there have been poems throughout our history that have been there that at times, as you said, Kathy, the cultural lens has turned to, maybe for different reasons or in different ways. But I definitely felt like in the editing that we did, we were part of a larger and older tradition. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I don't think I could improve upon anything that either of you have said, but I would point out, and I think I can point it out because I'm older than you guys. I'm looking around. I remember, when I was coming up, what poetry was like, and it's not like it is now, and it will never be that again, which I think is fantastic. But the point that we're all sort of getting at is that institutions have been transformed. I mean, Kathy touched on this talking about the New Republic, which has been around for a substantial portion of American history. It's been around since the 19th century. The nation has been around that long. Poetry's been around for over 100 years and so on. And so what you're seeing is that poetry and literature, as it sort of lived in such places as literary magazines or magazines, was not reflecting reality for a very long period of time. All that's happening now is that it's doing that, and in the process of reflecting what we all know, whatever we think and feel about issues of the day, to be reality. Those magazines and our culture have become transformed. And so I don't think it will ever go back to something that it was before. And what it was before, I don't think any of us would sort of put down, a kind of poem or poet or poetry. I mean, history has moments that arise out of necessity. And we're in one of those moments now. In a sense, we always were, but again, the magazines didn't reflect it. The literary history wasn't open to it. Our culture wasn't aware of it. All that's happening now is because people are aware of the poems and poets we're talking about. It means something that poetry hadn't meant for a long time. So I think it's very healthy and promising. that these transformations are happening, and I don't think that can be undone. I mean, who knows, you know? I just don't believe it. I just don't believe what is happening now will be undone. I mean, I think the strength of poetry has found itself thanks to not new writers, but writers who didn't have the audiences that other writers had before. There's been tectonic shifts, and I don't think you put those plates back flat.
Can I just quickly add something just to that? And I think part of it is also just technology and the way that's changed. Because you mentioned, you read Donovan Smith, and he's like, you know, his poetry has gone viral, you know, which is great. I mean, there are a lot of problems I have with technology, but it's also very much a democratizing process in that, you know, people can access poems so much easier, and I think that has also made it much more racially inclusive.
I also just want to bring, when we're talking about institutions, we have a sort of range of institutions, a range of publishers represented here, both publishing, you know, the New Republic and Poetry Magazine, but also, Carmen, you started Naomi Press, and maybe you can talk about what sort of entering into this sort of dialogue as a publisher of your own press meant for you.
I started Noemi Press with the intention always of publishing writers of color and endorsing the work of writers of color, but also recognizing that, and you know, I started it in 2002, which was it's like a different world that I'm talking about, and I think culturally, coming from a Latino background, my parents are both from South America, that the role of the poet and the political body aren't separate, that those two things are always sort of part of the canonical work of Latin American poets, how politics are always shaping poetics and or aesthetics, and that conversation is ongoing. And my awareness of that was a big part of my approach, but I think when I started Noemi Press, I also recognized the history of publishing, and especially the publishing of the work of people of color, and realized that I had a battle to fight against being marginalized as a press who only publishes people of color, as if that's problematic or that ghettoizes the press. And so it's been really interesting going through the process of building a press and publishing lots of different kinds of books and slowly building, I guess, a brand. While watching also the evolution of what I think the groundwork that was laid in the 80s and the early 90s of I remember my teachers, the first time that I read, for example, Gloria Anzaldúa, which I think for many women of color and many people of color is such an enormously important moment of recognizing that my sort of complex identity is completely normal and relevant. So watching subjectivity, that kind of neutral, uncontested subjectivity get contested, the poetics, maybe particularly lyric subjectivity being contested as being this kind of neutral space in which you know, I can have these kinds of experiences that tend to be inscripted white because of the canon. There's nothing specifically. It just happens to be that this enormous body of work that comes to represent American poetry just happened to be, when I was coming up as a young poet, very white. And so first of all, seeing how those early in the 90s and the early aughts, seeing that groundwork turning into legitimate outrage, which I hoped would happen. I never imagined that it would happen at this scale. And then just also adapting to the shifting model of publishing, I think that digital printing also has a big part. I think the technology and the shift to digital printing made starting a small press much easier, and I think that equalized the playing field in a way. You didn't need $5,000 to print a book of poetry. You needed $500, $1,000 to print out a couple of people, and that democratized, I think, the industry in a way that ended up helping people of color a lot. So I think what we're seeing now are just the gains that are built off of many generations of writers of color contesting the terms of subjectivity and slowly gaining ground. And I think the nomination of Barack Obama was kind of a tipping point for all of us, because it forced all of us to confront racism, some of us not in not so wonderful ways. But I think that it made us have to deal with this untouched subject, and there's no, I'm gonna echo what everyone say, there's no turning back. And so I feel like the work that Noemi is publishing is more and more engaged critically with that conversation, and also engaged with the conversation of I know that there's a conversation about gatekeepers that's really important, but I think the other more nuanced part of the conversation is the people who are building and generating aesthetic ideals. That conversation is also changing, that there's a wider range of participation by different kinds of people forming aesthetics, generating ideas of what poetry is and can be. And as a publisher, of course, I'm thrilled about that, and I hope that we are doing a good job of representing that work. But I feel like the millennial generation of poets are terrifyingly exciting and are visionary and are the ones who are going to change the world. And I guess I feel like the years that I put in building Noemi Press, I'm glad that I did that so I can provide a forum for these very exciting young writers.
I wanted to just push a little bit further at this idea of how poetry fits into the larger culture, what it does, especially when it comes to talking about issues related to race that other forms cannot do. I thought it was really interesting, Evie, when you talked about problematizing participation. I mean, I was struck too with in many of the poems you read, all of you, the sort of violence and beauty, and how they were intertwined in a way that was sort of problematizing. I thought a lot about the notion of argument. I mean, we're awash right now as a country in these very divisive arguments. And poetry, I think, has a way of both clarifying an argument and complicating an argument at the same time. But I thought maybe we could talk about what sort of function poetry serves, especially in talking about issues related to race that can be so fraught and divisive.
You had something very important to say. I want to hear it. I appreciate that question because one of the things that I think that we do when we make spaces for all of the various kinds of voices who are indeed writing is we sort of feed into a larger network. I'm wearing several hats at this point, sort of poet, publisher of poets, teacher of poets. And when I'm teaching a class and I have, even if it's not a poetry of color, a Black poetry class, for example, I'm just teaching creative writing classes, and I have a wide range of books that I can go to, journals that I can use, just pull off, and they don't teach my students something false about the way American poetry is being created right now and in the past, then that makes my job as teacher that much easier. The kinds of classroom conversations we can have expands, and it helps me normalize for them this way things are now, right? And it enables me to help bring a generation of people into writing for whom all of these traditions that make up American poetry and beyond are like already theirs, and that they will sort of be embodying those lessons, those aesthetics, those conversations as they begin their careers as creators.
I thought you brought up a good point about cultural appropriation. I think it is. I agree with everyone that it's. There are major cultural upheavals happening right now. there's also some growing pains too. As we're seeing in the national political stage, we're seeing echoes of that also in the literary stage as well, where, you know, there are, you know, more voices from different racial groups and sexualities, gender, politics, and so forth. But then there are also people like Lionel Shriver who, you know, I think there's now grievances on both sides, right? And there are also white writers who also feel these grievances, and cultural appropriation seems to keep popping up now. I can also cite the example of Ethan Chu. I don't even remember what his name was, that guy who pretended to be a Chinese poet and ended up in the best American poetry. And he seemed to think that he was now underrepresented, or he felt like he wasn't, you know, his identity as a white man was actually not, was preventing him from being published and so forth. So, you know, so there's identity politics happening from the white, you know, among white poets too. And one thing that I want to say about cultural appropriation is that, like, you know, is that you could, I think, and people have already said this, is that you can write about anything you want, you know, but you also, it's not like freedom, it's not a question of like freedom of speech or something, but if someone's criticizing you, you know, you're still saying what you want. You also have to be open to criticism. That's all you're going to be criticized. You know, people are going to attack, you know, people are going to talk back. Whereas before there wasn't that talking back, you know, and I think a lot of that has to do with, again, social media and the internet, where now, you know, Twitter is great. You know, people can talk back. People of color can talk back and feel like you can't do that. But that's not suppressing your rights. You know, one thing that I will have to say is that it's, you know, it's not just when, I think it's important for writers to write about other cultures, actually. But I think, like with anything else, it takes craft. It's not like, can I do it? It's how you do it. You know, it's about like having the empathy and doing the research and having the patience and really trying to understand. And that's something that Lionel Shriver did not seem to get, and what a lot of these writers don't seem to get when they bring it up again and again and again. So
I'm thinking we should take that issue a little bit closer to home and talk about the role that white editors and editors of color face when trying to publish and promote work related to race, work addressing race. I mean, I wrote a blog post about my experience with other white editors in my magazine Jubillant, and our failure to effectively publish writers of color. And in fact, the biggest change for us, I think, was not only having Evie and Kathy as editors, but Evie being able to access the listserv of Cave Canem. But I think there's larger sort of or deeper issues that writers of color and white or editors of color and white editors face when trying to do the best possible job of representing the widest possible community of poets. Maybe we could talk about that.
I'll say quickly that I mean, one of the things I think is implied in your question, but that I'd like to sort of say out loud is that when we're talking about publishing poems about race, part of what is just as important is publishing poets of color, whether they're talking about race or not, right?
Yeah.
And it's, I think in some ways, it's that moment when you're able to create enough of a space in a particular journal or publishing series, you know, poetry series or whatever it might be. When you create enough of a space where poets don't feel either like they're maybe a politicized aesthetic around race is unwelcome, nor that that's the only way that they can, you know, get in is by, you know, sort of proclaiming something that's identity-based or critique or protest-based. That's part of the work that, you know, that we were trying to do, and that I know that everyone up here is trying to do, and that's what makes the sea change, is that you've got people feeling called by what they already see in your pages. You know? So the hard part is getting over that initial tipping point. And that is where you have to go door to door, I think.
And I just say, I think that's true, the point you raised for editors of color, that you shouldn't be, there wasn't, I think, for both of you and for Terrence Hayes, who was an editor previous, you know, this sense, or at least I tried to not promote the sense of like, okay, now you're an editor of color, you must only publish writers of color, that's why you're here. I think that's, there are those assumptions on both sides in terms of how you have to negotiate expectations or cultural assumptions. Don, do you want to talk a little bit about what it's been like to change the pace of poetry and the challenges of that?
Well, I don't know. I don't think about how I feel about it. I think about how the world is. I mean, going back to what I think we've all been saying, in not the same ways, but related ways. If you look around and your literature, your art, your music isn't reflecting what you know to be true, whoever you might want to vote for, there's something wrong with your culture. And so I think a lot of poets that I talk to about these things actually didn't set out to write about terrible things happening in the news, but when they happen, they are called upon and they will say something. I think, you know, there's really no other way to respond to it other than to sort of measure poetry against what we know to be, you know, the feelings and atmospheres that we all live and breathe and eat and walk around in. I mean, everybody knows things, but they don't want to, you know, there are things that are hard for people to admit. There are things that are hard for people to concede. There are problems that are hard to, you know, and failures that are hard to own up to. And the poets aren't burdened with that so much. If they have been called upon to say things that maybe haven't been said before or hadn't been put in front of an audience before, or maybe they have their own way of saying it, all these things together. But there's a sort of startling reality about conversations relating to race that's interesting to me, because my grandparents on one side, great-grandparents on the other, were stateless people who came here as immigrants and didn't speak English. And I'm the first person in my family to be called a white person. My brother couldn't get into an Ivy League school because of her quotas. My father couldn't be a doctor for the same reason. And I grew up in bilingual households. I mean, the whole thing. And my family now has black people, white people, trans people in it. I'm an American about as ordinary as can be. And when I look around, or even when I hear what's going on, it's astounding to me how much in denial people are. Because what is a white person? Who are the people who are here? Where did they come from? How did they get here? And what did their ancestors do? So for me, you're just seeing a shift that, say, 100, 125 years ago, people assimilated because there was a dream in the American dream. You know, and now we know more about this dream and what it means day to day, minute to minute for people who can't access it. So now we have to think about our dreams differently, and that's what we need to count on the poets to do, and they're doing it, you know. So it's not just like there's a group and then there's another group. I mean, you know, you run into this. How do you, you know, want to start classifying anybody, whatever the terminology is? It's very tricky because in the end it can't be done without dehumanizing people or corralling sort of a group of what are in the end prejudices or stereotypes or sort of group thinking. And I think poetry has figured out lately how to sort out a lot of this stuff. And what we look around the nation and the world and see is that a lot of the politicians and people out there haven't got it yet. They haven't figured out how to cope with difficult things yet. They haven't been able to describe what it's like to have conflict, not only to be in conflict and experience conflict, but to be made up of conflicted kinds of things in your background. And I think, again, my belief in poetry, which I come by sort of empirically, not because I have some ideology about it or, you know, fantasy about it. I think the reality is these poets that we're talking about are so good, and the world is looking to us for this. What we need is for other people to sort of come on board too and figure out how, you know, what is a national discussion or international discussion of conflict and pain and violence and inequality going to be like? And the poets are getting at it. But the rest of the culture has other things operating in it that make it harder to value the kind of work that we do. But I do think that's changing, because I think it's hard if you're an editor to really see this, but like Poetry Magazine, most of the people who read it are not poets. They're not other poets. You often hear that poetry is written for other poets. Most of my readers are general readers. And they may hate or love or whatever what they see, but they get it. They understand it. And there is resistance, and resistance is good because it lays out for us the work that needs to be done.
I think it's interesting because it's not just a question of diversity and having more poets. I mean, it's not just like, okay, let's have more poems that address race. It's also kind of changing our assumptions about what a race poem is or what a poet of color should write. And I think that Nomi Press is really doing it, and that's what we were trying to do with Jubilot, and it's amazing how Poetry Magazine has been transformed. But I do think that, poetry is still very much an institution, or there's not Poetry Magazine.
Right.
It is. We're all part of an institution. We're in an institution. Yeah. But I think that it's also important, to be aware that I still feel like I'm a gatekeeper, even though I'm, someone of color. I'm still a gatekeeper, and that's something that I acknowledge. I do think that, but we're thinking about, say, prizes and so forth, and there's still an expectation on the kind of race poem that's accepted versus the kind of race poem that either baffles you, or you're just like, you just don't understand it, or it's a poem that has nothing to do with race, but it's written by a poet of color. And I think a lot of the problem is not just having more race poems in there, but it's also the fact that a lot of times we have a single frame of reference for what a race poem should be. And it's really important to broaden that frame of reference. I think there was reading an article where there was I think a lot of marginalized groups get plagued by this, where there's always the single story, which is like the single immigrant story, the single black story, the single Asian story, and everyone wants you to kind of fit in that template. And I see that happening a lot of times with the kind of attention that certain books get is that they fit that template. So it's really important so it's not just that. I think it's also just, broaden not just the voices, not just the having more diversity, but also changing sort of the way we think about what our assumptions as well.
I would add, too, that I think that this historical moment has been anticipated for many years in terms of how we navigate rhetoric. And we become, as a culture, we become so dichotomized and so convinced of our own infallibility. But poetry demands that we engage with nuance and we engage with paradox. And I think that's just another really interesting way in which poetry is poised to be a place where these conversations are inevitable, because we're not writing listicles, and we're not writing op-ed positions, which, again, I remember Deborah Tannen, many, that book, I don't remember what it's called, You Just Don't Understand, but I think it was called The Argument Culture, I think. And she talked about the experience, and I'll never forget this, because when I was reading it, this was like 15 years ago, I thought, oh, this seems a little alarmist, where she talked about how she was invited to a talk show, and what, as a linguist, as a scholar, she expected it to be, a conversation, but it would have ended up them saying, we want you to have this position, and then we're going to bring in this person to have this opposite reaction to your position. And that's not a productive way to approach the world, and it ends up being a very dangerous way to approach the world, because most of us don't live on these ends. Most of us live in the middle. And so I think that's part of the reason that poetry is having this moment right now, is that there aren't too many places in the world where we can have engaged, complex conversations about these subjects. And so my hope is, and I'm hearing that your sense of general audience, my hope is that poetry infects all discourses, and we start having more robust and complex conversations, because these dichotomies terrify me, because they leave most people out except people who are shouting the loudest at either end, and that silences a lot of people.
I'm going to open up to questions. Just let me bring the mic to you so that we can make sure we get the question recorded.
Well, the question that just came to my mind is that, is there any time in which any of us express ourselves either verbally or with physical movement or anything else in which race is not being expressed?
I understand the sort of the spirit behind your question, and I think you're right that because we live in a society that's grounded in racial ideology, was founded on it, could not exist as we know it without the history that is based in racism. At any point, we are all speaking from a racialized position, and that is going to have an impact. It's going to inform what we say or what we do, and it's going to inform how people hear us on the other side, right? So I think I would point to what Carmen was saying about a spectrum. I mean, there are times when race is not the thing that a person is trying to express, even if they're expressing it from a position that is located on a racialized landscape. Maybe the part of what we're thinking about together then is how to ensure that the way that landscape gets represented in the journals, in the poetry that's published, how to make sure that landscape is represented in its fullest. So I hope that gets at your question.
I would also say too that, to sort of jump on what Kathy was talking about, I do feel like there are a lot of poets of color writing poems that aren't quote unquote race poems, that there's a sort of place for that in the sort of poetry landscape, and I think that has much to do with not only the writers writing that work, but the publishers championing that work. That's really important. That sort of goes at that question, because if we assume that an African American writer can only write about one kind of way of seeing through race, it's a very reductionist sort of mode to think, and poems, as we've discussed, kind of problematize that in all sorts of wonderful ways and from all sorts of positions. But they do operate from an eye that can be kind of an empathetic eye too, an eye that we can all enter into.
I think that the other piece of that question, which I think is so important, is that even when race feels neutral, it's still activated in any engagement, in any conversation, in any exchange we have, and it's so pervasive. It's so pervasive that we have trained ourselves to take it for granted, and as a poet, and thinking about how when let's say I'm also a teacher. I teach a person of color, and I get a sense of a student saying, well, I have no use for this because this is not my race. So thank you. But the reality is that the same factors that, even though, let's say, the student is saying, this is a book by a Black poet, and I understand and I sympathize and I feel the pain and suffering, that in fact this same exact system that's oppressing the Black writer writing about their oppression is also oppressing this white person. They just aren't aware of it. They're just not aware that this is a very huge system designed to occlude the class discrepancies that are growing in the United States, and the ways in which our participation in horizontal oppression keep those with really the most money in control. And so I think that race, that we participate in race's role as a straw man discussion, when really it's economic inequities that's keeping us that's keeping us in many of these problematic positions. And so I think that reading all texts and through the lens of race is useful now, regardless of who's writing them, because race is this huge edifice that's, I don't know, I think we're looking at the wrong thing. Even though race is really relevant and important, and it's sort of inexcusable not to be thinking about it, I also think that there are many layers to how we navigate it, and classism is a much bigger, much more potent one. And we're working against each other. We're really fighting against each other when there's a much larger, more ominous and dangerous force that's working to oppress us.
I apologize for missing the reading. I was teaching myself. There's a quote from Beth Faria in Claudia Rankine, Racial Imaginary essay, and I wondered if you could respond to thinking about the evolution of the race poem. The quote is, "The universal is a fantasy, but we are captive still to a sensibility that champions the universal, while simultaneously defining the universal still as white. We are captive still to a style of championing literature that says work by writers of color succeeds when a white person can nevertheless relate to it, that it, quote, transcends its category." And, thinking about how the faces at the top of the publishing industry are changing, I'm curious, how much do you really think the race of home can evolve if the sensibility of readers just does not evolve with, the faces at the top of the industry?
Well, I think the way reader sensibility will evolve is just through exposure, and this is something that we as editors are doing, and what I'm trying to do and what everyone else is doing. And I think that before there was, as we all said, there were a lot less poets of color, or being published. Now there are more, and so it becomes that. I think in terms of the evolution of the race poem, what I am starting to see, I think, part of the growing thing that's happening now is that, with the changing also U.S. Census and American demographic changing, is that I think white America is slowly realizing that whiteness is not the universal, but a category, a racial category, which is very obvious, but it's not. We're only now really becoming aware of that. And it's also, the way the race poem can also evolve is how a poem by a white poet is acknowledged as race poem, and I'm also interested in that as well. Like, for instance, a lot of the criticism about the way we teach a poem by a Latino writer or Asian American writer or Black writers, that it's often from a sociological lens. What is this poem about? What does this poem say about this demographic or this short story, rather than looking at the craft and technique and so forth. And it's, of course, we have to expand, look at that poem in multiple ways. But I'm also interested, actually, in turning the table and being like, okay, here is a poem by, say, for instance, Joy Graham. How is this a white poem? What does this say sociologically about white people, and I think that's also, in certain ways, if we're going to acknowledge that whiteness is actually a category rather than the universal, is to also kind of look at what, which is what I think Claudia Rankine is doing. I think her next book is a book on whiteness,
Something in the first part of what you're quoting goes back to what William Empson said many decades ago, which is that the purpose, in a way, of imaginative literature is to put people in touch with people whose values are different from ours. In other words, this idea of the universal is really dangerous along lines that you've all described so well. But in terms of teaching, it's important too, because I think we see this a lot. This thing of poetry is good for you. It's we see every day hot takes in the media about how if you read, you get empathy and all this stuff. I think we sort of know it's not really true, or we wouldn't be living in the world that we're living in. But on the other hand, this fear of difference, whatever it is or constitutes or however it can be described, is something that seems to make people very touchy, and they do terrible things. But I think what poetry is going to do, in the way, again, that's been described already, is put the different ways of describing this out there so that people start to have a handle on it, how they imagine what it's like to be somebody who's in this kind of constellation of circumstances, but they didn't know that before. So you can see poetry doing that. The audiences are changing. The audience for poetry is changing, which is really great. And I think, more importantly, our way of teaching, not just poetry, but many things, has to somehow change. And our civic culture, which has to educate people about politics, has to change too. It's kind of a tall order, but it can be done. I mean, and whether or not it can be done, it has to be done.
Just really quickly, I think I'm agreeing with something you were saying, but I really wanted to bring out the aspect of audience, because there's a way that that parts of this discussion have unfolded with a sort of de facto white audience, I think, in mind, and the audiences for poetry have always been as diverse as the audience, as the writers of poetry and as America. It's the predecessors of Noemi, publishers, independent, from within different groups who've been the conduits for writers of color to audiences of color for many, many years, decades, century. It's the kind of finding a way to bring not just the writers, but also the audiences together that I think opens up a lot, and that's what I think we're all involved in.
One last question.
This question's for Carmen. Do you as a publisher think and explore about the difference of the cultural nuances between U.S. Latinos and Latin Americans?
Absolutely, and I mean, we also publish translation, a lot of Spanish-speaking poetries, and my culture, my background I can't escape it. I can't sort of exist outside of it, and so it absolutely informs my ethos and my politics as a publisher. But with that in mind, I love the new. I love the transgressive, and I would say that I feel like this new generation of poets are writing the most exciting stuff about race and identity, and so while I guess it's complicated because I'm editing, I'm doing some translation of a countercultural movement in Peru called Cloaca, which was born of the 80s, of the kind of martial law that was instituted by President Fujimori at the time. And I just see so much, I also just see so much similarity between some of the kind of the political turmoil that's taking place in late 20th century Latin America and then contemporary American politics, that the increasing disparity between classes, the horizontal oppression, the dissatisfaction with politics and the government. So, I feel like we're moving into this chapter in which we're becoming more like the rest of the Americas. And as a Latina, as a woman of South American descent, that's really, really interesting to me. And I'm paying attention to what I know about South American political and literary history, and just paying attention to see what things kind of crop up that seem similar as well. And it's kind of surprising. You probably have a similar experience being a translator of.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? It's like American culture is finally sort of kicking and screaming, being brought into its world citizenship, something to which our history has sort of, sort of stuck us there. And what we do with it is something you read about in the news. But it's almost like our existence as a group of people coming from all kinds of different places at every moment, amidst the movements and migrations of people in the world that are at its peak in recorded history. Never before have so many people been forced to move all over the place, that in a way now it's like we're, even just that we're able to have or need to have this discussion shows you that change is happening, and that it's a healthy thing. But there's a lot of, as you pointed out specifically, danger in it and invidiousness, and I think that is just the price you pay for kind of awakening people with language.
Well, and thankfully poetry is there to help us navigate, as you discussed. Thanks to all 4 of our poet editors, and thanks to all of you for coming out. There are books in the back by all of our presenters, so please buy some books, get them signed. Also, you should see a survey form near you. Please do fill it out. We use these surveys to determine how we do our programs going forward, so we'd love to get your input. You can give it to me, you can leave it on the table, and we hope to see you Thursday at 6:30 for Law and Literature with Monica Yoon here at the library, or for events happening in the future this season. So thanks again for coming up.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.